they can threaten the state by saying that if you do not do what we ask, we can just overthrow you.
Once you've reached the pinnacle, you are your president's favorite. There's not much incentive left to compete.
But there is also another problem. One day, I can just wake up and I can say, okay, I don't like you anymore. And there is nothing, no rule, because I have already broken all those rules helping you, for me to just erase you from the surface of the business world. Because I can just send the same tax authorities, same inspectors, everyone after you.
So a leader ends up having power to name favorites, but also make sure you know how easily they can take that away from you. Almost sounds like you're fighting to be the popular kid in school. But the consequences go past these relationships themselves.
When you have either the business or the state have that kind of power, which is unchecked, and there is no one who is not afraid to go after them, it will trickle down to everything in the country. It will start with the businesses, but one day you are going to see that opposition party leaders are being arrested. Because there is no judiciary which is completely independent from the executive branch. Executive branch used the judiciary for so long for its own economic growth purposes. Now they have people who are in fact doing exactly what they want. So one day they are going to ask those people to arrest their opposition.
She shows us how President Trump's policy approach is similar to when he was running a business. Meeting with people in Mar-a-Lago, networking to curry favors.
So is this a problem? He would say that no, you can run a country like a company, which is true. You can run a country like a company, but then we would have our city-states, which would be run like companies, and we wouldn't have nation-states. Nation-states are there for a reason. They have their borders, they have their rules, they are giving something to their citizenry, and it's not only the highest revenue.
Interesting. I think you touch upon a lot of topics ranging from different democratic institutions like judiciary, executive, media, and how all of them are interdependent on each other to create what is happening on the ground. In your research paper, you talk about how this dependence exists between the business class and the political class. Can you talk a little more about that? Like, what have you been able to see and how were you able to see that?
To start with, I have to say that I'm not the first one who realized that there's a connection between the political class and the business class. In fact, as the Google Scholar webpage says, I'm rising on the shoulder of the giants. It was first the economists and the political scientists together who realizes that we can look at the companies and we can infer something about their political connections by looking at their balance sheets. How do we do that, and how do I do that in my case? Not only balance sheets, but you also need to look at their board of trustees, their executive board, their CEO, their CFO, people they were hiring, because that gives you an incredibly wealthy information about a company. Then what you do is, when you are trying to understand the connection between the state and the business, is you are looking at the public procurements that they earned through legal process.
Emine highlights that when we're looking at state-business relationships, we need to pay attention to whether or not they have tax breaks or tax audits. What we find is different behavior from different kinds of companies. Companies which are close to the government have tax breaks over and over and over again. Companies which are not close to the government but are politically neutral, we'll see them paying their taxes or maybe evading taxes in standard ways we would imagine, like using offshore accounts. But the third group would be companies opposing the incumbent, or who the government sees as opposition. And in these cases, the tax authority goes after them. So considering a company's tax behavior can tell us a lot about the kind of state-business relationships we're looking at. And that's actually how Emine started her project.
My first project was something about taxes. then I realized that going through the balance sheet, I'm like, wait a second, there is a pattern here. There are some firms which are getting tax breaks, and there are some firms which are exactly in the same business, but they're not getting any tax breaks. In fact, they're getting tax audits and fines.
Emine began digging deeper into other studies of businesses with political connections, and found these patterns already exist in history, specifically around new democracies in Latin America like Chile and Argentina. In Chile, a study by Gonzalez and Prem developed a database of board members of the most influential Chilean firms and studied these individuals based on their connections to the Pinochet government. Pinochet was a military dictator in the late 20th century. They found that people aligned with Pinochet did very well during his time in government, but once he was removed from office, these same individuals also lost their business success. In Argentina, which was under military dictatorship until the 1980s, a study found that firms who were connected to the dictatorship had more success breaking workers' strikes than those who didn't have these connections. So, just as in Emine's research, we're seeing that in these systems, the big differentiator of success for businesses can be how closely they're connected to the rulers.
If one can and the other cannot, it means that the judiciary is not looking at the case exactly the same way. And judiciary is not looking at the case exactly the same way because the executive is not looking at the cases exactly the same way. And that is about the predictability. What do we know about democracies? We know that if we go to court for a given crime, we know what that crime's penalty is. But if that penalty differs from person to person, we don't call it a democracy. There are many other names that we call that kind of regime. So,
before we move on, I want to introduce the concept of the rally around the flag effect. This is important to connect these relationships to periods of conflict. How do the businesses react, and what happens to their connection with the rulers? This theory, which is popular among researchers, notices that political leaders can get more support and a quieter opposition during international conflict or crisis. In effect, the people of a country see themselves as banding together against a common enemy and give their leader extra support. In Emine's research, she looks at conflict and whether we see a rally around the flag effect in the context of the Kurdish issue in Turkey. As we talked about how Turkey's historical industry decisions were driven by ethnic divide, we want to note that this tension still exists. The Kurds are the largest minority in Turkey, and they have had a contentious relationship with the Turkish government since Turkey's founding. Given a cycle of rebellions and repression between the Kurds and the Turkish government, Erdogan's AKP made a compelling campaign promise to create peace with the Kurds, and a peace process was officially started in 2013 to attempt to finally come to a resolution. Relationships between the government and the Kurds deteriorated, however,
militants after an upsurge in violence.
I don't think it's possible to continue a peace process with those who take aim at our national security and brotherhood in this country.
Emine studies the behavior of the businesses before and after this collapse.
Coming back to how do you see this in Turkey? I think you also talk about how conflict was used as an evidence in your paper to show that when there's a conflict, actually I'll let you speak about it and that I think you'll be able to.
So, in fact, the conflict part of that paper is this. So, usually that's a different literature in political science. We are trying to understand how rally around the flag effect works. So, we are trying to see whether or not it's always the case that the incumbent can win after a period of conflict. And on that case, we have conflicting accounts. In fact, there are some cases when there is an outbreak of conflict, the incumbent loses the election. And there are some cases when there is an outbreak of conflict, the incumbent wins the election. And even if before that they were projected to lose. So my first question was, in fact, okay, is there a way to measure this relationship? Can we measure the relationship between incumbency and conflict? And I say that, okay, let's look what happened to the incumbent after the conflict by looking at the market. I'm looking at the firms to understand what is going to happen to their dictator. So instead of asking if those firms are going to survive after their dictator, I'm asking the question, does the market think the dictator is going to survive after this period?
So, for a bit of economics here. We know that stock markets determine prices based on how investors think the future will happen, and they can plan ahead for big shifts that might make a difference in the success or failure of certain firms, and adjust how much they value those firms accordingly. The recent U.S. presidential election is an example of this. Depending on whether Trump or Biden won, market prices would have adjusted differently based on investors' thoughts of who would succeed under each president. The exception to this planning is periods of conflict. These can't be anticipated, so they make an interesting point of study.
And you look at the market, and in my case in Turkey, the market prices AKP, the incumbent connected firms, higher than all the other firms, which means that the market does not expect those firms to lose their leader. In fact, they were expecting them to have an even stronger leader, so they are putting all their eggs in the basket of the firms which are connected to the government.
Businesses seem to have decided it was best for them to continue a strong connection with Erdoğan's ruling party.
Now that brings the question, okay, then why during a conflict they're not putting their money to the military? Because during the 20 years of AKP government in Turkey, the military's hold on Turkish politics diminishes. So now everyone knows that if there is a power vacuum, it's not the military who's going to step up. They know that it's going to be one of the parties.
And just to clarify over here, how do you measure political connections in your research?
First case.
I'm looking at the board of directors, and I'm checking if those directors were ex-member of the parliament, or they were anyway affiliated with AKP, which is they can be founding members, they can run local party branches.
Then
I started looking at familial relations, which are very important in Turkey, who is married to whom, and I'm trying to see if board of executives or CEOs or CFOs have family members who are married to people who are high-ranking in the AKP government.
A third case, she looks at whether they were given tax breaks or fines. Fourth.
Then I'm looking at Erdoğan's own speeches, where he talks about some companies with contempt and with some companies high price.
Finally.
And then there is a part where I call expert survey, which is I ask traders to rank the companies, 1 being closer to the incumbent, 5 being the further away from the incumbent, the furthest away from the incumbent, and I made them rank the company. The easiest parts were the Gülen affiliated ones. So Fethullah Gülen is the one who tried to stage a coup in Turkey in 2016, and all the companies that are affiliated with him were confiscated by the state. So it was really easy to see who were affiliated with Gülen, and with the main opposition party it's easy too, because the largest bank in Turkey, they have the shares in that bank, so it's very close, they are close to.
That completely makes sense. I think what we have been able to do till now is I've been able to establish a connection between the business class and political class. And how does this unchecked power of political class create uncertainty in the environment? And even though there's economic growth, even if there is GDP per capita growth, it can still have long-term implications on the society. If I have to, let's say, move and pivot into how do we change the dynamic that exists currently, right? Do you even see any incentive from the business class towards changing this current dynamic?
I'm going to give you an anecdote in Turkey. When AKP first came to power, they went after a businessman called Cem Uzan. He owned one of the largest telecommunications companies in Turkey. So he also owned the very first private TV channel in Turkey, which means that there were state channels up until then. Now he is offering a private channel, which is an incredible thing if you think about democracy and how news media is being formulated around. So the very first thing I